All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into some fascinating stuff. We've got a whole stack of your notes and excerpts all about behavioral assessment. Looks like it's mainly from a psychology textbook you sent us, UNIT-2.pdf, right?
Yep, that's the one.
Buckle up, because this is going way beyond those personality quizzes we all love to take online. We're going full-on detective mode here.
That's a great way to put it.
We're going to be figuring out the why behind the actions, the motivations, instead of just slapping labels on things. You know, like instead of just saying, oh, they're anxious, we want to understand what's making them anxious.
Exactly. It's about getting to the root of behavior.
And get this, you're going to learn how psychologists can be seriously sneaky sometimes.
Oh yeah, we've got some tricks up our sleeves.
Think hidden cameras. Think analyzing your trash. Don't worry, we're not doing that to you.
At least not for this episode.
But seriously, these are some of the methods used to understand behavior in the real world.
They can be controversial, for sure, but they can also provide incredible insights.
And of course, we'll get into the ethical side of all of this. But first things first, what exactly is behavioral assessment?
Well, at its core, it's about understanding the function of a behavior. Not just the form, what it looks like, but the why behind it.
That makes sense.
So imagine you see two people both looking angry. That's the form of the behavior. But one might be seeking attention,
Oh, I see.
while the other might be totally overwhelmed and about to explode. Those are two very different functions, and behavioral assessment helps us tease those apart.
Oh, okay, I'm starting to get it. So it's like seeing someone slam a door doesn't tell you the whole story. Were they furious? Were they trying to kill a spider?
Right, exactly.
It's about going deeper. And it seems like those traditional assessments, like personality tests or whatever, they don't really get at that, do they?
They can be helpful for certain things, but they often miss that crucial why, you know?
Yeah, they just kind of give you a label.
Right, exactly. And behavioral assessment is more rooted in this idea that behavior is learned. It's a response to our environment, to what we've experienced.
So it's not just about some fixed personality trait.
Not necessarily. The textbook you shared actually mentions how behaviorists back in the day weren't satisfied with the old way of thinking about mental illness, you know?
Yeah.
That medical model where everything was a symptom of some deep underlying problem.
Yeah.
They wanted to figure out how to change behavior, not just diagnose it.
Ooh, that's a big difference.
It is.
So if we're playing detective here,
We are.
what are some of the tools of the trade?
Let's see.
The source material mentions a whole bunch of different methods for behavioral assessment.
It does. There's a whole toolkit.
It's like a detective's toolkit, right?
Exactly. We've got, well, let's start with self-report methods. This is kind of the classic stuff, you know, interviews, questionnaires.
Questionnaires, like those rating scales where you circle a number to show how much you agree with something.
Exactly. Those are all part of it.
The textbook actually name drops a few of them. There's the MMPI-2, the 16 Personality Factor Questionnaire, the California Personality Inventory. I've definitely seen those floating around online.
Oh, yeah. Those are some of the well-known standardized ones. They try to measure personality traits or look for potential red flags. But like any tool, they have their limitations, right?
For sure. I mean, people aren't always the best judges of themselves, are they?
Not always, no.
Sometimes we want to present ourselves in a certain way, or we just genuinely don't recognize certain patterns in our own behavior.
That's a really good point. And that's where some of the other methods come in.
Makes sense. So what about direct observation? That one sounds pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there's more to it than just like watching someone.
There is.
How do you even observe behavior objectively?
That's trickier than it sounds.
Yeah.
You've got to have careful planning and, you know, specific methods. For example, there's continuous monitoring, where you track every single instance of a behavior during a set time period.
Oh,
And then there's time allocation, where you're basically recording what someone is doing at predetermined intervals. Like every 15 minutes, you note what they're doing.
I see, I see. So that would be useful for like a teacher trying to figure out why a student keeps getting out of their seat.
Exactly.
Or maybe a manager trying to see how much time their employees are actually spending working versus, you know, goofing off on the internet.
Right.
But wouldn't people act differently if they knew they were being watched?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a huge challenge with direct observation. It's called the Hawthorne effect. People change their behavior when they know they're being observed.
Makes sense.
Sometimes researchers try to be a little sneaky about it, you know, blend into the background or use hidden cameras.
Speaking of sneaky,
Oh boy, here we go.
the textbook mentions something called unobtrusive observation, and this is where it gets really interesting.
And maybe a little creepy.
Maybe a little creepy.
Yeah.
Tell me more about how you study behavior without people even knowing it.
This is where we get into using traces of behavior. Have you heard the Arizona Garbage Project?
The garbage project.
Yeah. These researchers, uh, they literally analyzed people's trash to understand their consumption habits.
Wow, really?
Yeah. It sounds wild, but it revealed stuff that people wouldn't necessarily admit to in a survey,
Yeah,
you know?
I can imagine.
Or think about all the online behavior that we leave behind. Our browsing history, our social media posts, all of that leaves a digital trail that can reveal patterns in our behavior.
So basically, our digital footprint is like a gold mine for behavioral detectives.
Pretty much.
That's fascinating and a bit unnerving, to be honest.
Yeah, I can see why. And that brings us to the ethical considerations.
Right.
When people are unaware they're being studied, there are huge concerns about privacy and consent.
Of course.
It's a really complex issue.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a slippery slope.
Right.
So if we want to be ethical and still learn something, what about analog observation? The source material talks about creating these like artificial settings to study behavior. What's that all about?
Well, it's kind of a compromise between observing in the real world and having complete control like you would in a lab. So you create a simulated situation that mimics real life, but in a controlled environment.
Mm.
So for example, instead of watching a kid on a chaotic playground, you might set up a playroom with specific toys and activities that are designed to trigger certain behaviors.
Oh, that's smart. So you can control the variables and see how the kid reacts to different stimuli.
Yeah, that's the idea.
It's like a mini experiment, but with more real-world relevance than just being in a sterile lab.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got self-report, direct observation, sneaky, unobtrusive observation, and the more controlled analog observation. That's the whole toolkit, right? Or are there more ways to become a behavior detective?
There's one more that's really interesting. Self-monitoring. This is where the individual becomes their own observer. They track their behaviors, their thoughts, their feelings over time. They might keep a diary or use an app or data sheets to record their experiences.
Wow, so it's like turning that observation inward, becoming super aware of your own patterns. I bet that could be really empowering.
It can be. It's often used in therapy to help people manage things like anxiety, depression, or unhealthy habits.
That makes sense.
It helps people identify their triggers, track their progress, gain insights that they might not otherwise notice.
But wouldn't just the act of monitoring itself change your behavior? Like if I'm keeping track of every cookie I eat, I might eat fewer cookies just because I'm aware of it.
You've hit on something really important there. That's called reactivity. And it's definitely something to consider. But get this, that reactivity can actually be helpful.
Oh, how so?
Because if you're monitoring your behavior and you're trying to change it for the better, that awareness can actually reinforce those positive changes.
So it's like having a built-in accountability partner, right?
Exactly.
In your own mind. That's really cool. Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground here.
We have.
From questionnaires to trash analysis to self-reflection. I'm really starting to see how complex and fascinating this whole world of behavioral assessment is.
It really is.
But I'm curious, how does this all connect back to our own lives? How can understanding the why of behavior actually be empowering for us?
That's the key question. And it's one we'll definitely dig into more in the next part of our deep dive. So ready to put on our detective hats and get a little deeper into this?
Absolutely. I'm ready to solve some behavioral mysteries.
Great, because remember how we talked about how behavior is rarely random?
Right. There's a reason behind everything we do.
Exactly. And that's true for everyone, not just the people psychologists study. Your actions, my actions, they're usually driven by some underlying function, even if we're not consciously aware of it.
Okay, I can buy that. But how do we start to figure out what that function is, especially for ourselves? Like, we need to become detectives in our own lives, right?
You got it. And just like any good detective, we need to start by looking for clues. Pay attention to patterns. Notice when certain behaviors tend to pop up. What's happening right before?
The triggers.
The triggers, exactly. What happens afterward? Are there any consequences that seem to be reinforcing that behavior?
Oh, okay. So, like, if I always seem to reach for a snack when I'm stressed, the stress would be the trigger, and that temporary relief from snacking would be the reinforcement.
Perfect example. You're getting it. And remember, the source material also talked about how we need to look at different modes of behavior, not just our actions.
Oh, right.
Our thoughts, our feelings, even physical sensations.
Yeah, that's right. It's all connected.
It is. Our thoughts, emotions, bodily sensations, they all play a role in shaping our behavior. So by becoming more aware of what's happening internally, we can understand what's really driving us.
I'm starting to see how this could be really empowering. Instead of feeling like our behaviors are just happening to us, it's like we can understand the gears turning, you know, and maybe make different choices.
Exactly. It's about moving from a place of reactivity to a place of proactivity. Instead of just reacting to our environment or our emotions, we can anticipate our own responses and choose a different path.
Wow, that's a big shift in perspective.
It is. It reminds me of that quote. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose.
Oh, I love that quote.
It perfectly captures what we're talking about.
It does. It really highlights that we do have a choice, even in those tough moments.
Exactly. And that's where real growth and freedom come from.
So instead of just letting our emotions run the show or falling into those same old patterns, we can pause, we can recognize what's happening, and make a more deliberate choice.
That's it.
This makes me think about the self-monitoring method we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Tracking our behaviors, thoughts, feelings. It's like we're creating that space, that pause button.
Absolutely. Self-monitoring is so powerful for cultivating mindfulness. You're observing yourself, but without judgment. You can identify those patterns, and you can even experiment with different ways of responding.
This is making me think of when I was trying to get a handle on my procrastination habit.
Yeah.
I used to beat myself up about it all the time, but then I started keeping a journal.
Yeah.
I was tracking when I was most likely to procrastinate, and you know what? I noticed a really clear pattern.
Oh, tell me more.
I would always put off tasks that felt overwhelming or anxiety-provoking.
Ah, that makes perfect sense. So by recognizing that trigger, in this case, those feelings of overwhelm, you could start experimenting with ways to manage that anxiety and break that procrastination cycle.
Exactly. It was a game changer. Instead of just feeling bad about myself for procrastinating, I could actually do something about it. I could address the anxiety.
I love that. And that's the beauty of this approach. It's not about labeling yourself as good or bad. It's about understanding what's influencing your actions. And then, if you want to, making a different choice.
It's like taking the judgment out of it and just approaching it like scientifically.
Right.
Observing, experimenting, seeing what works.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about understanding ourselves better, but how do we apply this to the people around us? You know, we all know how easy it is to misinterpret other people's actions, and that can lead to so much conflict.
Oh, it's so true. We constantly jump to conclusions about why someone is acting a certain way.
Yeah.
But remember, their behavior, just like ours, is probably driven by some underlying need or motivation.
So instead of assuming the worst, what if we try to figure out the why behind their actions?
That's it.
What are they trying to achieve? What are they trying to avoid?
Exactly. Instead of thinking, why are they doing this to me? Ask yourself, what might be driving their behavior? What need are they trying to meet?
Wow, that's a powerful shift in perspective.
It is.
It takes the focus off of blame and judgment and puts it on, like, curiosity and empathy.
Yes. And that's so crucial for any kind of healthy relationship, especially when there's conflict.
Absolutely. When we approach others with understanding, it just opens up so much more space for dialogue and connection, even when we disagree.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
We can see each other as humans, with complex motivations, not just adversaries.
And that human connection is where real understanding begins. Okay, I think we've covered a ton of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the methods of behavioral assessment, how understanding the function of behavior can be so empowering, and even how we can apply this to our relationships. Is there anything else we should highlight before we wrap up?
I think we've hit the main points from the source material, but I do want to leave our listener with something to think about.
This has been fascinating. I'm already thinking about, some of my own patterns I want to explore further. But before we wrap up completely, I did want to touch on something we kind of skimmed over earlier. The future of behavioral assessment. The source material mentioned some potential challenges ahead, right?
It did. It
Yeah.
pointed out this trend toward briefer, more cost-effective methods of assessment.
Which makes sense, right?
Yeah, in a world with busy schedules and limited resources, I get it.
Mhm.
But it could also lead to an over-reliance on those quick self-report measures, like the questionnaires we talked about.
Yeah.
And we already discussed how those can be limited.
Right. You don't get the full picture.
Exactly. It's like trying to judge a book by its cover.
Yeah,
You get a glimpse, but you miss all the depth and nuance.
totally.
So that's the challenge moving forward, finding that balance between efficiency and thoroughness.
Right.
How do we incorporate those valuable insights from observation and other methods, but still be mindful of real-world constraints?
Yeah. Time and resources, all of that.
Exactly. It's a call for innovation.
It is.
How do we get creative and find new approaches that are both insightful and practical?
I'm optimistic. I think we can do it.
I am too. And technology is already changing the game. We've got wearable sensors now that can track things like heart rate and brain activity in real time. And the software that's being developed to analyze behavioral data, it's incredible.
That's so exciting. It seems like the future of behavioral assessment is going to be this like amazing blend of cutting-edge technology with those core principles we talked about.
I think so too.
Observation, analysis, truly understanding people.
Exactly. And the more we learn, the better equipped we'll be to help people, to create positive change for individuals and for society as a whole.
That's a fantastic note to end on. Thank you so much for guiding us through this deep dive. It's been truly eye-opening.
The pleasure was mine. It's been a great conversation. And to our listener, thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We hope you enjoyed exploring the world of behavioral assessment with us. Until next time, keep diving deep, keep learning, and keep asking those why questions.